a lot of folks were doing exactly what I did earlier in my life and career, which was going with the flow and the status quo and kind of taking the driver's seat in their own life and just following the path that was laid out for them as to how others define success and what their life should look like. And in some cases that works, but in many it leads to feeling unfulfilled or stagnated.
Thanks for tuning in to the Top Down Podcast. I am Josh Mastel, your host. On this episode, Darrah Brustein stops by. Darrah is an exceptional human being. She's an entrepreneur, a business owner, an author, and one of the most connected people that I have ever had the opportunity to meet. She's actually a local Atlanta entrepreneur for you local Atlanta folks. She drops some serious heat around how to be properly networking, tips and tricks to be really great at networking, growing and expanding your network, helping other people out. She talks about, for those of you looking to really live a better life where you're in more control, doing what you want to be doing, some questions to be asking yourself for that. She digs into a lot of that stuff. Really, really happy to have her here today. You're going to enjoy this. Stay tuned. All right, thanks for joining us on this episode of the Top Down Podcast. We have a really, really exciting and fun guest with us. Darrah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, so for those of you who aren't in tune, the visitors here, the listeners here who aren't in tune of who you are, why don't you give us a little bit of a bio, like just kind of explain a bit of what you're doing, who you are, and then we'll dive in from there.
Sure. Well, hey, everybody. I'm Darrah, as Josh shared. I have a bit of a nonlinear path that I will give you the Cliffs Notes version of, which basically was I moved down to Atlanta 17 years ago to study religion and Italian in college and not want to become the first female Jewish pope when I graduated. So as a result, I did the next most natural thing and started my career in the fashion industry. And after that company went under in 2007, at the beginning of the recession, it was about 3 months after I had bought a home in Darrahs, having a restraining order against my landlord at the time. And I started to kind of shudder and get scared and realize, like, oh, is this what grown-up life is like? Is this what the future holds? And ended up trying several different career paths and jobs and all sorts of stuff for the next few years. But this was in the 2007 to 2009 timeframe when the economy was collapsing, and lost those jobs as well. So in 2009, I decided to do what I always wanted to do as a kid, but that the world had sort of told me was just the impatient millennial in me, which was start my own business. So I was lucky to have my twin brother saddle up to me and say, hey, listen, I have an idea and I think we should do this together. And his idea was for us to start a credit card processing brokerage together, which basically blended the brokerage model that is really tried and true in financial services, but wasn't represented in credit card processing. So with a little bit of me saying like, hey, this doesn't sound interesting or sexy, I said, all right, I have nothing to lose. Let me give this a try, and actually learned a really valuable lesson through it, that instead of chasing the thing I already knew I was passionate about, like fashion, that I could become passionate about the thing I was selling if the day-to-day and the outcomes that we were generating for our customers were aligned with what my values were and things that I was good at. And so I backed myself into something that I became really passionate about. And fast forward 10 years later, we operate that business in 38 states. But through the process of that, we had lots of ups and downs. We had a couple embezzlements. We had a lot of rugs pulled out from under us. And it wasn't a straight up path. And while we were up and downing that trajectory, I had a friend from undergrad move back to Atlanta, and she asked me, how do you make friends after college without getting hit on, sold to, or everyone being your parents' age? And I thought, I can't think of a single place in Atlanta that does something that isn't one or more of those things. And my favorite thing, I think my gift in the world, is as a connector. So I said, why don't I just do something and start it for you? And lo and behold, began my next business sort of by accident, and started Network Under 40 and subsequently Network Over 40, where now we connect over 30,000 people across a number of mid-tier US cities to develop real, authentic relationships first based on who you are, not what you do. And so as time ticked on and I watched the shambles of the global market, I stopped and realized that the way that I was raised to have really sound financial principles and had a deep understanding of financial responsibility was not the way that other people were necessarily raised. So I decided to take those lessons, mix it with something else that I felt that I had skill at, which was being a writer. And I wrote a children's book on financial literacy education for 6 to 9 year olds. So, about that was about 8 years total of entrepreneurial journey wrapped into a couple minutes. But if now you meet me in a place where about a year and a half ago, I had this deep intuitive hit that told me there's a new incarnation of your career on the horizon and you better figure it out. And that was a little overwhelming and daunting because I had finally hit a place with my businesses where things were running fairly seamlessly and many cases without a lot of effort because I had built teams to help me operate them. And I was ready to enjoy the fruits of my labor. But as you may know from your own experiences like this, when your gut is telling you something and you ignore it, it gets louder and louder until you pay attention. So I paid attention. I did some deep self reflection over the course of 6 months and came out on the other side to realize that the number one thing that people ask me now, or at that time, it was, how do you live the life that you do? And I realized when I dug deeper into that question that what they meant was, how do you have the freedom and flexibility that you have? How do you run and operate these different companies in completely different industries while traveling 50 to 60% of the time for pleasure? How do you be in rooms like Davos, TED, and the UN? How do you write for outlets like Forbes? How do you work and partner with people like Deepak Chopra? And I had done none of it ever to impress other people or to brag. I was simply just living my life as things unfolded and felt aligned for me. But what I realized through that process is that a lot of folks were doing exactly what I did earlier in my life and career, which was going with the flow and the status quo and kind of taking the driver's seat in their own life and just following the path that was laid out for them as to how others define success and what their life should look like. And in some cases that works, but in many it leads to feeling unfulfilled or stagnated. And so I really felt like at that point I was at a place in my career where I wanted to give back tremendously and take everything that I had learned and gathered and create a substantial amount of content to support people in those ways.
It's awesome. I mean, that is some incredible stuff. I mean, to give our listeners some context, I'm pretty new to Atlanta. I've been here about 3 or 4 months. Darrah's been here. What'd you say? 17 years you've been in Atlanta
Yeah,
now?
exactly.
And I've heard her name or seen her name probably as much, if not more than any other name since I've
Wow.
been here, of a complete stranger, just from, I think, a lot of the work that you do with Network Under 40 and just a lot of things that you're involved in. So I've been really excited to have you on and have this chance to talk with you.
Well,
So that's
thank
a
you.
good props to you. But super interesting story. Obviously, it looks like you have your hands in a lot of things. I think we can take this conversation down a few different roads. I want to kind of hit on a couple of things that you talked about earlier because there's some like hot topics for me right now, and one of them you mentioned was how you were in 2007, 2008. You were at a point in your career, young professional, and you mentioned that you bounced around and tried a lot of different things in your career. And the reason that stuck out to me is I was literally in an interview with a young person this morning, just coming out of college. And I was talking to them about, the average person coming out of college right now, I think, has that feeling like they're supposed to have their life figured out and they're supposed to know exactly what they should be doing in their career and what they're great at. And their professors tell them to go find their dream as a 22-year-old kid. And it kind of struck, I imagine you have a pretty good take on that. So if you go back to when you were 22, 23, what advice do you give to people right now graduating college? It's May right now too. It's graduation season. This is
That's
perfect
true.
timing.
Yeah, well, so I actually coincidentally sit on the board of Emory, which is where I went to school. And I have a lot of these conversations with undergraduates and graduate students who are impendingly going out into the real world. And I remember looking back at myself at that time and feeling really overwhelmed and fearful because most of my friends at the time had pretty clear paths. They were going to be doctors, lawyers, consultants, traditional business careers. And that had a path that they could traverse versus me. I had no idea. And so I remember very vividly sitting down with a young woman who was a senior at Emory. And I was sharing with her a bit about my journey. And I said to her, listen, I'm a big advocate for a nonlinear path and a non-traditional career path, and that you can be a multi-hyphenate person, and that there's jobs that exist today that didn't even exist a couple of years ago. And so you don't have to map it all out today. And she was so emotional. And she said, "This means so much to me because my parents have always wanted me to be a doctor. And, I've gone down that path and I've taken all those classes and I took my MCATs, but that's not really what I want to do." And it really gave her this freedom to consider, what do I actually want and how do I move my steps in that direction? So, for anyone who's, whether it's graduating or you're just in a place in your career where you realize it's not serving you, maybe it's serving someone else's dreams for your life, but not your own, then I highly recommend that you pause long enough to do some reflection and understand, what do you want for yourself? I have a lot of exercises that can help with this if you want to hear any of them.
Yeah, let's share a couple. I think this is a good topic right now.
So, one of them involves leaning on the people that care about you, so your network. So, if you want to put this in your show notes, or if you just simply want to Google Forbes, Darrah, and network find your path, you'll get right there. And it's a set of questions that I use with my network and other people use with theirs based on this exercise in a non reciprocated manner, where you ask them questions all in writing, like, when do you see me as my most powerful? When do you see me as my least? What's something you know about me that you don't think I know about myself? What is something that you wish for me in the next 12 months? And so on. There's 7 or 9 questions. And your intention is to say to them, listen, I'm hoping that you can reflect on me some of my blind spots or some things that I might take for granted in myself. And just say, the only response I'll have for you is thank you. I'm not going to ask for clarification. I'm not going to defend anything. I just really respect and admire what you have to say. And like I said, it won't be reciprocated. This isn't a two-way exercise, so that no one feels like, hey, if I share something, you're going to turn it right back around on me. And the goal is to do 10 or 20 of these and then bring them together and suss out patterns and identify, is there anything in there that maybe you didn't recognize? So, an example of this, when I was 23, I did this for myself for the first time. And something that came out as highlighted was that everyone came to me when the chips were down, is one of the questions, because they said that I was a connector and they knew that I was always going to listen and I was always going to connect them to the person or opportunity that they really needed. And at the time, I didn't understand that as valuable. I felt like everyone can do that. That's not unique or special, until all these people whom I cared about in different arenas of my life were able to reflect back on me and say, no, that is unique. And that is the thing that you are excellent at. And I was able to then really build on that and leverage it. So sometimes it's as simple as that, where you can pull something out. So that's one exercise. I have several more, so I'm trying to decide which one I should give you. I mean, another one is really simple, and it's a matter of being diligent about collecting brainstorms. So when I mentioned that 6-month period, I carried around a physical notebook. You could also do this in an Evernote or your notes on your phone. And I wrote down anything from the following categories. I wrote down things that I was really great at as a kid, things that gave me energy now and back then, things that I'm really drawn to or gravitate towards, things that people come to me for, things that make me jealous because that's a cue that I want it for myself. And I would just write all of these interests and proclivities and energizing things down without any question, without any judgment. And after I finally got to a point where I was like, okay, I'm saying the same things over and over, and I knew I was tapped out, then I went back and I started mixing them together in weird amalgamations. And I would say, okay, well, I like fashion and I like languages and I like religion. I like spirituality and I like this. And I would just start like meshing 2, 3, 4 of them together in weird ways, even if I had never seen it functionally in the world before, just to allow myself to creatively brainstorm and put myself out of the box of careers or things one can do in their life that I had actually seen modeled. So I think
Mm.
that's a really good other exercise. And then on my website, if anyone wants to go there, there's a lot of other content that could be helpful to help you do some of these early stage brainstorms.
That's really cool. I love what you mentioned about you thinking that what's special about you isn't unique. I think a lot of people, you've always had that skill set about you, so you don't know that it's unique until someone from the outside tells you that. You just think that's how everybody is.
Yep.
I think that's a really cool exercise. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
That leads pretty cool. I think that leads nicely into a big theme that you talk about through. I've taken in some of your content and checked out your LinkedIn, that kind of stuff. And a life, living a life by your own design seems to be kind of your theme, like your marching orders for your life, which is really cool. That kind of leads what we just talked about into that topic. Like, could you kind of explain that to the folks listening in? What do you mean by that? How do you live your life that way? Let's kind of dive into that topic.
Yeah, I mean, definitely what we were talking about is a great precursor to help someone set off on that path. But living a life of your own design means that you are the driver of your own car, that you are the writer of your own book of your life, that you are not allowing culture or society or family or anyone to dictate what you really know and believe is going to make you feel fulfilled and happy in the end. And so it really means taking some asserted action, for example, like some of the ones that we just talked about, to allow you to move in that direction. And so for me, when I look back and I think, everyone told me, like I said, that you're just this entitled millennial who can't wait your turn. And that's why you think you should be at the top of the marching orders and why you want your own business. When really, when I reflected back to being a child, I remember starting businesses on my front porch and trying to sell crap to my parents' friends, and that this was always something that I was made for, but that I let other people's voices deter me from that. And same thing, I took job after job after job thinking, well, this looks good on paper. This is sexy to talk about at a cocktail party or whatever the thing was. And I kept deferring and delaying what I actually knew was best for me. And the other piece of that too is I think not all of us really know what's best for us, which is why it takes some of these reflections or even visualizations and meditations to tap back into your own intuition and some of those memories.
100%. Now, there's, I think entrepreneurship right now is unfortunately a little bit of a fad. And I think that it's cool to be an entrepreneur and anyone can do it. And it's kind of a cool thing right now. And, I think the truth is there's just some people that aren't born to be entrepreneurs. Like they weren't on their front porch selling things as a kid. They don't have that in their DNA. They weren't starting up businesses when they were younger. Like I think there's a lot of people out there trying to force it that aren't that way, and they're probably failing because of that. But can we apply living a life by design in your mind to someone who's not an entrepreneur? Like maybe they are a contributor at a company and they know that's what they're supposed to be doing and they're fine with that. How can they still live that life by design, as you call it?
Absolutely. I mean, one, people can often be entrepreneurial where you can take the same mindset of being a builder, a creator, or an innovator and do it with inside a company. I definitely agree with you. I call it the American idolization effect of entrepreneurship, where everyone thinks like it's the sexiest thing and that it just happens overnight, that you show up one day and suddenly you're on the cover of every magazine and have the $1 billion exit, when we know that things are called unicorns for a reason because they're generally mythical. And I think that it's done a bit of a disservice to people like you're describing who might feel like that's not for them. Or, I don't think that every entrepreneur is born to be one. I do think some people situationally become entrepreneurs. I have two brothers. One is my partner, my other has his own business. And he was not necessarily born to be one, but he happened into a situation with a great idea and a lot of great backing. And he had the wherewithal to do it, but he definitely wasn't out of the womb to be an entrepreneur. So I do think that both are possible and plausible, and that they should be treated differently. But as it pertains to people who want to have a traditional job, that's great, because also entrepreneurs, we need those people, and that the ecosystem doesn't work without both. It all just comes down to being intentional. And for me, like I have this equation where I see it as you intentionally design your life and define success for yourself. You then build a career and or a business to fund and elevate that rather than consume it, which often we're guilty of, no matter if we're working for someone else or for ourselves. And then lastly, you build a network and a community to support you and open the doors to the success that you're seeking. And for me, those are like the three major points to live a life by design, not by default. And that doesn't matter what your job is. It doesn't matter what your title is. It doesn't matter what your industry is. It just matters that it's really aligned with your values and your deep desire and vision for your life.
Good stuff. Awesome. I agree with that. So let's talk about the network under 40. I know, like, what was your inspiration in starting that? I know you talked a little bit about it in the beginning. Would love to dive into that. And I'm sure there's a ton of lessons in business, in life, in personal relationships that you've learned from all the people you've met at that group. And I'd like to kind of dive into that.
Yeah. So it was my friend who had graduated from law school and came back in her mid 20s. And it was the first time, I think a lot of us have experienced this, where you're in your young adulthood and suddenly you don't have a built in social network and you don't have a structure around it if you're no longer in school. And she moved back, and it was the first time she had come face to face with that and just kind of wondered, where do I go to actually make peers where they're not trying to force a business card in my face? They're not trying to get my phone number to go on a date. They're not looking down on me because I'm earlier in my career, and they're not all in my industry. And she and I both realized that didn't exist, but how valuable it is to be amongst peers who are growing together and valuing each other based on who you actually are, not on your title or a transaction or anything else. Because at the end of the day, relationships are about a long game, and they're about connecting with people whom you actually enjoy being around. I think a lot of people get that wrong, and it's why networking has been so bastardized and got such a bad rap, because so many people do it in a shady, shitty way. And so when I started that, I was amazed at how people were so excited. Our first event had 94 people, and everyone was like, "This is electric. We want to do this again." And in my mind, I'm like, "This is like a glorified happy hour." But they loved it. And I started to realize that because we instituted our values really clearly into our marketing and into the people who showed up at the first event, primarily because 90 of the 94 were my friends, it was really easy to have that value system perpetuate and permeate into our future events and even into our future markets where we moved into new cities. And it was easy for us to institute little things into the events themselves that allowed for people who had maybe never even been or never really heard anything about us to feel that ingrained into our value system and our culture, which is why it has continued to be successful. Because frankly, at the end of the day, and this is no news to anyone, even though we are technically as connected and more connected than we've ever been, we're actually the most disconnected and lonely than we have ever been. So people are truly craving these types of organizations and environments when they're doing it from an organic and authentic perspective. So actually, as a result of that, after doing the events for about 2 years, out of nowhere, Inc. magazine showed up at one of our events and wrote an article that I didn't know they were going to write, that said something along the lines, is a very close paraphrase, that said, "Networking events suck. However, here's one that's doing it right," and pointed to my event specifically that was just in Atlanta at the time, which then catalyzed this tale of people all over the world asking, "Hey, how do we do this? How do we do this?" Which then put me on a mission to realize, hey, I can help other people do this in other places, because at the end of the day, I believe so deeply in connection. I believe so deeply in the power of that, and that we all need it as humans. We are social beings. No matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert, it can look different ways, but we all need human connection. We all need to be seen and acknowledged and validated. So we started expanding into other cities. And then even more recently, we've launched a course that allows people at their own pace online to take the blueprint of everything we've learned doing this for 8+ years, and me doing it as a consultant for universities and schools and other organizations, to do their own networking events, to build a profitable side income by doing this and having it pour into whatever they do full time, so that they can grow their impact, income, and influence along the way.
So what are some of the main takeaways if one of our listeners was starting a networking group in Texas, and they're like, hey, what are some of the top points that we should really be thinking about to make sure that we're not in that lane of all the other garbage networking events that are out there, which you nailed. I mean, almost every networking event I've been to is a colossal waste of time. But like, what would be like, what makes it different? What's the secret sauce? Like, I know you mentioned your values earlier. Like maybe that's the answers in there, but what is it?
Yeah, there's a lot to it. And the values piece, it's easy to just say, like, these are our values. It's another thing to make sure every ounce and nook and cranny of what you do, what you say, how you act, everything is aligned with that and embodies it, whether or not you actually have to say it or read it. So for us, it's in how we choose our venues. It's in when we choose to plan our events. It's in how you are greeted. It's in the copy we use in all of our marketing and communications. It's in our giving centric and, giving forward mindset, where 4 out of 5 emails we send are all about value. They're videos teaching people how to be better at networking. They're offering, tangible advice for them and not selling them a damn thing. It's putting it deeply ingrained and engendered into everything that you do. So even for us, like, we have 2 little tools and tricks that we've put into every one of our events that have also been tiny but so critical. One is that we have ambassadors who wear shirts that are with our color and our logo, and on the back it says huge across their back, "Let's talk." And there's 10 to 15 of them at each of our events. And they become what I call the concierge or the buoys for our community, so that when you come, if you don't feel, like you can easily integrate, or it's hard for you to break into a conversation, or you have a question, or you want to be introduced to someone, you can go to them and they're there for you. They're ready to help answer anything and get you woven in any way. And they're also looking out. If they see someone standing alone, they're the first one to swoop in and make them feel welcomed. And those little things matter and add up. And then secondly, we do something again that is so simple, but so overlooked, where we don't emphasize people's business on their name tags. Instead, like they can write it, but instead we have them answer a question of the night that is just about rapport building. So our questions might be anything from, when the Olympics were happening, we'd say, if you could win a gold medal in any sport, real or fake, what would it be? Or we might say, what's something that you're reading right now? Or where's somewhere you'd love to travel? Or when it's Halloween, what's your favorite Halloween costume of all time? The questions are not deep necessarily, but they're questions that just are able to help you spark a connection with someone quickly and begin to build that rapport, so that you don't do what I think is the most dreaded question on the planet and immediately just ask someone, what do they do? Because as a result of that, people feel sized up. They feel like you're looking for a transaction from them. It feels often like you're quickly making a judgment about, do I want to talk to you? Are you valuable to me? When instead, people are so much more than that. And they also represent an average of 250 other people in their Rolodex or LinkedIn contacts, that if you burn that opportunity, you've also missed out on any opportunity to get to know their network.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, what I've been surprised about in Atlanta is, so far, I've been here for 4 or 5 months now. It is probably one of the most networked cities I've ever been to, in that most people that I do meet are like, hey, let me introduce you to this guy. It's like a small city, that I'm from Chicago in the Midwest, and like it's just a little bit colder there. Like I find that very surprising. Do you have the same experience or opinion of Atlanta, or maybe you
Yeah,
created help create that?
it's actually one of the things I love most, which is saying a lot because I love a lot about Atlanta. But it's that there is a real culture of collaboration here, and there is a real abundance mindset over scarcity, where people see it as your success does not diminish mine, and a rising tide raises all ships. And that is more often than not the case with people here.
Yeah, I think there's such a good startup scene here too, that there's some collaboration and some, like, everyone's kind of cheering on that, the tech startup scene or any startup scene or small business. I think there's a big stronghold of that too, which is always refreshing.
Totally.
Let's talk about some networking tips. Like, young professionals. I'm trying to think of people who could use the most help, and I'm trying to keep in mind who most of our listeners are. We have a lot of young professionals, like young salespeople that listen into this podcast. We have a lot of like tech startup founders who, typically are a little bit less confident in the networking scene. They're more techie, they're engineer kind of minded, and it may be a little bit intimidating for them. Any tips for those two groups of people?
Yeah, lots. The first is stop selling and start building relationships. Second is make sure that you're looking at this from the long game perspective, even if you feel like you have deadlines to hit and investors to please or sales goals that you must get to. It will behoove you both now and in the long run to look at people from a perspective of, how can I offer value to you first? How can I be asking you sincere questions and getting to know you, that I can be a sleuth and almost uncover opportunities for me to add value to make an introduction, to offer a resource, to, recommend an event for you, whatever it might be that is useful, because people don't forget those things. Those really matter. And I want to make this very clear, that you don't do this to manipulate. You don't do it because you expect a quid pro quo outcome. However, we are wired as human beings to have a reciprocity reflex. And so when you do great things for people, people are naturally going to want to know how they can offer something in return, which is when it becomes really important to have your ask clear and ready and concise, and know what your needs are. And your ask should never be something that makes that person feel targeted or like they are the person you've been trying to sell and manipulate to get to that point. Much better ways to say, hey, I'd love your advice about this. Like yesterday, I was at a meeting with someone from BlackRock. They're bringing 1,000 employees to Atlanta. And I have a product that I think fits really well within an HR space, that is the Life by Design Summit. And it teaches people how to do all these tools from 45 global leaders on this stuff. And I said, truly, this is something that I have a curiosity around, if it would integrate as a value additive approach for employers and HR departments to give as a continuing education piece for their employees. And I asked him, is there someone in your HR department who'd be willing to have a quick conversation with me and give me some feedback? And he jumped at it and said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. Versus me saying like, hey, I've got this thing, let me sell it to you. Like, people like to give advice. They don't like to be sold to. So definitely those things. And for people who feel like I don't have time to be generous, or what do I have to offer in the first place? I have an exercise or a challenge that I recommend that you try. It's what I call give it forward. And I recommend 30 days, commit to yourself to one person a day, make an offer to be of value or of service to them in some way with no strings attached. So that might be like me making a quick phone call to Josh and saying, hey, Josh, I made a personal commitment to give it forward to one person a day for 30 days with absolutely no strings attached. You're the person I'd love to help today. I'm curious, is there anything that you're working on that you're needing help with, that you're struggling with, that you're excited about? Like, what's going on? Like, help them a little bit, which is why it's also important to be a person who's ready with your ask when you have these opportunities. And then you also say, like, hey, listen, I want you to understand that I can't be a magical fairy, and I'm not guaranteeing that this outcome will be it'll just come to fruition, but I do promise that I'll try. And so an example of this, I had a friend who, when I have done this one of many, many times, said to me, okay, great. I live in Oregon and you live in Georgia, and I want to play on the top 50 golf courses in the world. So can you get me on Augusta National? And that was a 2 to 3 month endeavor for me, where I worked every person, not worked them, but I worked every angle of every person I knew who had a connection to or was a member at Georgia or at Augusta National, and ultimately failed. It was basically a fool's errand. However, I went back to him and I just said, listen, Sean, I spent the last 2 to 3 months working on this. I went down a lot of rabbit holes. None of them panned out. And even though it didn't work, Sean and I have never been closer, because he was like, I cannot believe how much energy and effort you put into that. Versus on the other side of the extreme, I've had people just say, my babysitter canceled. I need it for tonight. Do you know anyone? And I've been able to make a quick text message and get something lined up with a 5-minute effort. And as a result of this, it really allows you to build deeper relationships with people. It allows you to reconnect with people in your network or even kickstart a relationship. It allows you to see how much you have to offer in this world that often we neglect. And it also allows you to feel really good. Because what I've come to find is that any moment where you're feeling stressed or anxious or stuck in your own BS, doing anything for other people is the fastest antidote to getting out of that.
100%. I love it. I love it. I love it. I mean, I'm starting the 30-day today.
Nice.
Like I'm in. I love it. I think that's so fun. It's crazy that you bring that up, because I was talking to somebody yesterday that was in line at Chick-fil-A drive-through, and they're like, "Hey, the person in front of me bought my meal for me." So I bought the meal for the person behind me. And then this person I was talking to talked to the person that was working the counter at the drive-through. And the lady's like, yeah, this has been going on for 4 hours.
Wow. I mean, it's amazing.
Like,
And
yeah,
it's such
that's
a
cool.
visualization of the ripple effect that happens when
Totally.
you do good in the world. And that's the other piece. When someone will probably naturally say to you, what can I do to repay you? All you say is give it forward.
Love it. Love it. That's really, really cool. That was a great challenge. All right. One last thing I want to dive into, because it's super interesting. Your relationship with Deepak Chopra, which is really, really cool. I was on the treadmill this morning and I was watching some of your guys' videos. Really, 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 really love it. Give us some context on what that is, how that came about, and the kind of work that you're doing. I think for those of you listening, and I'll put this in the notes here, but you need to go check out some of these videos. I mean, just tons and tons and tons of wisdom on all areas of your life. I highly recommend you go check some of this out, but I'd love to hear the story from you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll definitely tell you a story. But you're right. The gamut of wisdom is so varying. It goes from leadership to sex to money to effortlessness and everything in between. So we cover everything. And
Love it.
basically, the version of the story that is quickest is about this time last year. I had this intention to run a virtual conference. I had never been to one, I had never planned one, but I wanted to create an opportunity for people to learn from and interact with all of my peers and mentors who had helped me on my journey to design my life intentionally, and do it in these 3 pillars that we talked about of defining success for yourself and kind of getting over the hurdles and roadblocks or any fears or trepidations you have, and then designing your career or entrepreneurial journey to elevate that and fund it, and then your network to support it. And so through it, I said, I want this to be free. It's going to be all online. And I had cobbled together all of these incredible folks, everyone from Adam Grant to Kat Cole to NBA legends and all stars and beyond. And I said, Deepak Chopra is someone who I really want to keynote this and headline it. But he was one of the only ones that I actually didn't have a personal relationship with. The distinction was I saw him as a mentor from afar. You know, I think mentorship is really critical no matter what you do in the world. But there's a lot of ways to have mentors. You can have people in the more traditional old school sense where one person pours deeply into you because probably they see something of themselves in you and they want to invest in that way and it feels good. But that's a heavy lift. There's also what I call co-mentorship, where let's say, Josh, you had a skill that I was really looking to grow and vice versa. And we're kind of peers in that way. And we co-mentor each other until there's a natural resolution to that. And we go back to being friends. So I think that's another way. And then there's mentoring moments where you might have 5 minutes with someone or 10 or 20 minutes, and they're able to mentor you and guide you on something that they have a skill in that you're looking to learn about, but it doesn't have to be an ongoing relationship. And then lastly, there's mentors from afar like Deepak or whomever that might be for folks, where you ingest their content because it exists and they don't even know you exist, but they're mentoring you in that capacity. And so Deepak was that for me. And because I'm the type who practices what I preach and I pour into the well of my relationships before I need anything, I was able to say to my network, listen, I want to connect with Deepak. Does anyone know his team? And so I was almost immediately connected to his publicist, who liked the idea, but kept asking me who else is doing it, which made it very clear that they weren't sold. So then I dug a little deeper and I reached out to my friend Rebecca, whom I had met about 6 years prior at a conference in Detroit. And this, I think, is another great example of when you meet people, don't give a damn what they do. Give a damn about, do you actually connect, and how do you just develop a friendship? Because those are the people you're going to want to keep in your circle anyway. And thanks to Dunbar's number, we know that we have a maximum of about 155 people we can actually be in true relationship with. So most important that you actually like them. So Rebecca was one of these people, just really liked her. And we became friends. And over the course of our friendship, I later came to learn that she was formerly Deepak's COO. So I hadn't initially reached out to her because I understand that that's a precious relationship and I didn't want to ask for it. And so at that point, I basically said, listen, Rebecca, here's an out. If you don't feel inclined to do this or it's too much of an ask, I totally get it. If you do feel comfortable, here's where I am. It would mean a lot if you could give some credibility to this. She said, no problem, sent me a screenshot of her text message to him. And moments later, I had a response from his publicist saying, can you be in New York next week to interview him? Small asterisk, I had never interviewed someone before, and he was my first interview ever. So that was special. So I show up and we have this incredible time, and I'm just on cloud nine thinking, wow, once in a lifetime opportunity, sitting face to face with an idol of mine. This is nuts. And I thought, that's it, the end. Lucky me. Now I get to share this information with everyone else, la-di-da. Until 3 months later, out of the blue, I had a serendipitous moment where Chase Bank reached out to me and they said, we're running a conference in Atlanta and we want you to be our on-site correspondent, and you're going to interview Cam Newton and Deepak Chopra. And I just stopped and laughed and I said, you got to be kidding me. I just interviewed Deepak 3 months ago. That's great. I went, he remembered me. It was lovely. We had a great time. Fast forward, his publicist took a great liking to me and they asked me to interview him 3 more times throughout the course of 2018. Here's where the real thing happened and where this is really important for people to pay attention. That the day after Christmas 2018, I had an intuition that said, even though you've thanked him every single time you've already interacted and worked together, you need to reach out to him as well as all the other high profile people you've worked with that year, which ended up being a nice sum of people. And just thank them again and let them know that you're here in their court to support them if they need anything in 2019. It was not about me. It was not about an ask. It was none of those things. It was, hey, out of the blue, just I'm thinking about you. Thank you again. I'm here for you. 15 minutes after I sent that email, I got an email back from Deepak that said something along the lines of, I've been reflecting as well. My work is often considered pretty esoteric and hard to understand. I think you can help me make it more understandable. So obviously I responded and said, great, what do you mean? And in about 15 minutes of ping pong emails back and forth, we came up with this video series that ultimately he suggested we call Diving Deep with Deepak and Darrah. And we do these video segments that make the deep relatable and translatable into your life, typically in just a few minutes flat. And it's been this exceptional, incredible experience for me to be able to sit side by side and have my own interactions with him and ask him any questions and then share them with the world. And then to just have this reflection back to say that we are all not very far from the people that we admire in this world. And that if you come at it from this value-centric giving perspective, doors will be opened.
100%. I mean, what a way to, I think, end this podcast, this interview. Like, that story pretty much sums up you actually putting into practice every single thing that we just talked through. True. How to build genuine relationships, how to give first. And I mean, that really, really incredible story. I mean, I think people are getting a ton of value out of that already. I know you guys are getting a decent amount of attraction on that on YouTube, and well done on that.
Thank you.
Where can people find you? Like, where should people go look you up and engage with you, engage with your content, attend the events? Where can people go check you down at?
Yeah, an easy spot to start is my website. It's just Darrah, Darrah.co. On there, you're going to find everything from interviews with high profile folks like Shaquille O'Neal and Seth Godin and Robert Herjavec and Jillian Michaels and Bobby Brown talking about some of the secrets to their success, as well as a free masterclass with Deepak and myself and this whole video series that we're talking about. I also have a guide on there that's been read over 1.2 million times called the 55 Best Questions to Ask to Break the Ice and Really Get to Know Someone. So, for anyone who's feeling like I could use a little leg up in my icebreakers and in my networking or in my continuous cultivation of my relationships, that's the thing for you, totally free. So check that out. If you're in Baltimore, Nashville, or Atlanta, check out networkunder40.com for our events. If that course is interesting to you, that's also on my website that I mentioned. And then lastly, I show up every single day on Instagram, adding value in any way that I can to share more tactical and inspirational advice like we did today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Those of you listening that are still with us, forward this along to someone that you think it could give some help to. Feel free to tag either Darrah or myself on social media. If you have any questions, ask away, and we'll be engaging on there to make sure to answer them. But Darrah, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.